Hello, I'm Jonathan Stark, and welcome to Inside the Brackets. Today, our show is all about cross-platform apps. As devices, platforms, and browsers multiply, what do developers need to know to build apps that truly run everywhere? Joining us today are Bill Giard, Principal Engineer at Intel, Eric Engelman, Lead Front-End Developer for Human Use, Peter McLaughlin, Chief Product Officer and Co-Founder of Mobify, and Tim Kadlec, Independent Web Developer and Responsive Design Expert. Tim, let's start with a fundamental question. Why should people worry about developing apps that run everywhere? Wouldn't it be easier to just focus on a particular platform and stick with that?
I think the fundamental reason is the reach. The web as a platform provides a ubiquity that no other platform has ever touched or come close to being able to offer. When you build something that is web-based and cross-platform, what you're doing is you're building something that's going to allow you to hit a bunch of different devices, different browsers, different operating systems, and that's becoming more and more important with the increasing diversity of devices that we're seeing.
I think the biggest benefit is definitely reach, and another good reason for going that way is just because it's possible. It was very difficult before the web to support multiple platforms. You would have probably looked at having to have two completely separate code bases or one code base for every platform that you needed to support. I won't go so far as to say that it's easy to support multiple platforms, but it's a lot easier than it used to be, and the added reach means that there's going to be an ROI on the investment from a commercial aspect.
So to Peter, when we say cross-platform app, what does that actually mean today? What are we talking about there? What's the sort of scope of cross-platform these days?
I think that if we're talking web, then cross-platform means both operating system and device. So there's a variety of devices running. Windows, for example, we've got the Surface, we have Windows Phone 8, then we've got iOS devices, we've got Macs, PCs. So really cross-platform means writing something, an app, that's going to actually support all of these screen sizes as well as their underlying operating system and all the dependencies that exist in the platform.
And I would add cross-browser compatibility. So we end up looking at OS, browser, and screen size become super important.
I think that's key because I think we get a lot of the discussion ends up talking about screen size, and obviously for obvious reasons. I mean, that's the biggest, most noticeable difference that you get. But in terms of capabilities and functionality and underlying processing speed and things like that, all of that stuff figures into it as well.
What about
so
input
it's extended
modes?
beyond that.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely, input modes. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing quite a bit of differences there too in terms of what's touch versus non-touch versus devices that can do both versus gestural things with leap motion and technologies like that, voice input.
I think it's quite astonishing that these layers of complexity that have been added with newer technologies and newer platforms, they're most easily reached by web applications. And when you look at the foundation of these features and where they come into play, the line between what's possible with a native app and what's possible with a web app is starting to blur.
I think it's actually one of the biggest challenges that a user experience designer needs to handle in an app. It seems like we're getting the expertise there to make good designs for multi-screen. Now we've got a number of challenges coming down, like for example, Tim mentioned input modalities like gesture, like voice. These are still pretty unexplored, uncharted territories, but it's now, support is growing in the browser for those input methods. And the challenge is going to be how do we design the apps to accept those inputs? How do we take advantage of what those input methods bring?
Absolutely, especially with, we get sort of watches on one end that seem like they're getting some traction, and then TVs on the other end where voice would obviously be a good input method.
I mean, it's going to change, right? The way you're going to tackle a smartwatch, I assume, from the market perspective, it's not going to be quite the same thing. I suspect with a lot of those wearable kind of technologies, you're talking about, second screen, secondary sort of devices. Yep. You're going to serve things differently to them.
I mean, I think something that's pretty exciting there is, are those screens going to be linked in some way? Are we going to need markup that allows the developer to say, here is side channel information to put on the secondary screen? And that's a discussion that I think is being had, but not widely right now.
And I think looking towards the future, you may find that different devices form for different reasons. So while you want an app to maybe cross, say, a smart refrigerator with a watch, these two things will obviously have a very different user experience, but using a web system as a backend, it really helps to share the data, but present it in a more meaningful way for that device.
I think understanding the usage of the device and how it adds value to the users is super important. I mean, in years past, it would have been an effort of trying to port the entire app on every device.
Right.
But now it's about what are the transactions and functions that add value to the user, and then giving them in a good, unique user experience. And so don't try to do everything on every device. Do what the user would find useful and beneficial. I think you need to have a seamless experience, right? I think, I've seen people do a separate mobile app that looks and feels different, that the transactions don't actually flow between the desktop to the tablet to the phone. And so you have to approach your, usability studies in such a way that says, how do I understand the user when they're using it on this device versus a different device, and then scale up, scale down.
That consistency and continuity is very important. It's people aren't interacting with a company through one device or one browser. It's a constellation of experiences.
So let's actually flip it around and say, what are the common denominators across all of these platforms that we're developing for?
Web technologies, web runtime environment seems to be common on every platform. You're starting to see it emerge a little bit on wearables, because I think it's not quite mature enough to have implemented web runtime environments there yet, but I think they'll get there pretty close.
I would completely agree with that. The web is the single biggest, like the target that you can achieve that has the biggest reach of any platform that you could write code for today. And as an added advantage to that, there's more developers who are familiar with that platform than any other specific platform out there. So that also makes it quite attractive.
So if you subscribe to the notion that people are just going to continue to have more and more devices instead of consolidating down to just a phone or just a laptop, then it makes sense that you probably want to support them wherever they want to be in most cases.
Even with OS-specific runtimes, you look like the Windows runtime environment, you can code for HTML5, CSS3, bring that into a Windows runtime environment, and optimize for that specific platform. Similar store for Android or iOS with those native runtime containers. And so I think the notion of design for the most common capabilities and then extend and optimize as needed, if it's needed, when it's needed, is a good strategy.
All right, so let me be devil's advocate for a second. Are there any experiences that you can think of that wouldn't make sense to be cross-platform? Would be better served just being target a single platform, whether that's iOS or Android or Windows, Linux?
Absolutely. If you have a project with controlled customer base and you know that this is only going for specific platforms, it might be a little bit overkill to try to reach 80% of platforms when you need only one of those, say one of 20.
Although on sort of the other side of that equation, given the lifespan of the average device, if you anticipate there being a day in a year or 2 years when that particular group of people who are using that application might have to upgrade or change the device, you might be served by investing a little bit more.
That's true.
In it up front to make sure that you have the ability to support other devices relatively
That's
easily.
something that really should never be forgotten. So
yeah,
in some cases, maybe a hybrid approach.
I think it's super dangerous to code for a specific platform. You may not optimize and test for the other platforms, but your standard should be, and your expectation should be, developing a framework that will allow me to run on anything if my user base or my environment changes and my devices expire. And then optimize, right? Think about adding and saying, hey, what is not standard across platforms, and optimize that way. But your basis and your expectation, the new expectation, I believe, is run on any device, even if you have the case where you don't want to pay for the testing and optimization across everything. That may be a perfect valid decision. I've only got one now, so I'm not going to optimize for the rest, but I'm going to expect that may change.
the web's killer feature has been discoverability and serendipity. You can immediately begin using a website assuming it doesn't load too slowly. But most websites you can immediately begin using when you pull them up in your browser. If you are instead getting a link to an app in the App Store, then there's a bunch of extra steps that you need to take before you're up and running with that app, and that's a barrier.
Definitely. We've had conversations with people on the other side of the fence. So, for example, we talked to the folks at LinkedIn, and they switched. They push you into their native experience, and they're aware of the friction, but the engagement that they get from that smaller percentage of people who do end up with the native iOS app, for example, is 10x what they get from the web experience. So it's sort of a balance, I think.
Yeah, I think what I'd throw out there is native typically is about rewarding your most loyal users with an experience that takes them to the next level. And that's a little bit different on the social networking side of things. I think that social networks are something that people engage with every day, and that could be another reason why you might want to target native is if you're providing something that is of value to a person's day-to-day life, there might be a good reason for them to put that icon on the home screen. But this research, I think, is maybe 1 or 2 years old, but there was research from Google showing that people had only loaded 10 native apps in the last month, and something like 5 of those were games or social, which doesn't leave very many slots for your particular app. On the other hand, they'd visited a lot more than 10 websites in the last 30 days. And the math there is just that unless you're providing something of value that the person is going to use daily, it's unlikely that you're going to get any benefits from sitting on the home screen.
I think a lot of companies, the companies that are really flourishing in the current environment and are going to continue to flourish are the ones that are leveraging both technologies where appropriate.
I would say 95% of the time web should be your baseline, and that 5% is really targeted at your power users or your most engaged users.
So something that comes up all the time in a cross-platform discussion is responsive web design. And it's not a silver bullet, but it's extremely powerful. What would you guys say are sort of the pros and cons? Like where is it awesome and where does it kind of fall down?
It's awesome in reaching the different screen sizes and maintaining consistent user experience across those screen sizes. Where a lot of times when you look at one native app versus another native app, portrait versus a landscape could have completely different configurations. If you're doing this with a web app, you can keep that primarily very consistent. And that I think is a huge benefit, and that plays directly into the value of the UX.
I think what it offers is the ability to support these multiple screen sizes, but its biggest challenge is that it doesn't necessarily give you the ability to optimize for those screen sizes. So we talked a little bit about the information architecture challenges earlier. As a technique, responsive design is just about reflowing the content. So if that means reflowing the content from left to right, top to bottom, that definitely might not support your visitor's use case or the app user's use case. And that's where you may need to apply adaptive strategies or some other technique to get the information architecture of the page to where you need to go.
I think that's the distinction between responsive design as a technique and responsive design as a strategy. Companies that kind of come at it from a strategic perspective, like that is their multi-device strategy, that's where you start to see a lot of those sorts of issues, things that maybe they weren't paying attention to the performance, or they were just stacking content, or not optimizing for the capabilities of devices. But when you approach it as responsive design is another tool, it's another technique in my stack, then it doesn't preclude you from any of that. It just becomes another technology that you're leveraging that's letting you get there.
So I want to sort of throw a weird question out there. Does responsive web design play any role in sort of Internet of Things? Or is that more of a machine-to-machine communication, do you guys think?
In some sense it may, but I think primarily it might not, because the Internet of Things is more along the lines of a machine communicating to a machine. And there's no interaction with the user per se, but that's not to say that there won't be. In the cases that there will be, then sure, responsive design will play a role as a tool set for this. But when you have just a machine talking to a machine, it's just pure data.
I think when you're starting to talk about that, everything we've been talking about in terms of wearables and hitting these other devices as well, you're starting to talk more about the importance of structured content, having some sort of delivery, like an API or something like that you can build off of and send your data to all of these different places, which is not just a good strategy for Internet of Things, but a good strategy for any multi-device approach, really.
From a design strategy and architecture strategy, if you looked at just the responsive web design technology, you may question, hey, how applicable is that currently on Internet of Things? But if you look at responsive web design as a application architecture strategy that connects to RESTful services and data backends, I think it does come into play, because then you're taking the visualization piece out of it and exposing potentially some of those same services to Internet of Things devices.
That separation is something that's becoming more and more prominent these days. And it started with Web 2.0. You separate your presentation layer from your data, and that will come into even more of a play with the Internet of Things. Because most of the data will be behind the scenes, and what it needs to display is only what the user is interested in.
So what are some of the downsides of cross-platform development? Doesn't testing become increasingly complex across all of these devices? How are people dealing with that?
Absolutely. I think what I hear is usually about 3 times the testing from a lot of our customers. What our customer success team has found works effectively as a strategy for coping with some of that is, I won't name names, but to basically develop a device library of the worst devices. And exhaustive testing may not be possible on every single device in the landscape. There's too many out there, but often we can test on the worst offenders and have a pretty good idea that it's going to perform well on everything else. Visual storyboards can be very helpful for that, especially if you really do expect the result to be the same. In terms of automation, what you can do is you generate those visual storyboards as an image, and you can do pixel comparison. You say, we made some code changes. Is the output image actually the same now as it was before?
Yeah, there's no getting around the added complexity of the testing, but by providing the layers of the automation wherever you can to be able to check for regressions wherever you can, that gives you a nice base to start from, and then finishing off with actual real device testing. And again, you don't need to test on every single device and every single platform. You make that determination based on your analytics, based on your users, and eventually you sort of develop this tacit knowledge as well.
So, closing thoughts. What's the hardest thing about building an app that runs everywhere?
That's a great question. I'm going to go back to, I think that the hardest part about building an app that works everywhere is it's not as much the technology as it is the understanding that there's a shift in workflow, a shift in process, and that you can't go into it with the same sort of approach that we've tackled our projects traditionally and expect to succeed.
I would have to say optimization is probably the biggest challenge. Getting to a place where you support applications that run everywhere is not nearly as difficult as it used to be. Getting to the point where each of those experiences is optimized remains a very difficult problem.
I think there's really 2. One is the technology one, that understanding the runtime environment of what can be displayed and rendered. The one that actually keeps me up at night a little bit more is the cultural shift, the expectation that our solution providers or our developers have to really embracing the new world order of multiple devices in the landscape. Do I really have to change? And it is a significant cultural shift.
That's all the time we have today. Thanks to each of our guests, and thanks to you for joining us on Inside the Brackets. And be sure to join us in the coming months as we explore topics like cross-platform performance and real-world stories about enterprise application development. See you next time.